Brittany, 1488, the year the world stopped being kind. In the highest tower of Chateau de Nantes, beneath skies the color of bruises, a 12-year-old girl gripped a cold stone window as if it were the last thing tethering her to the earth. Below her, the fields of her homeland were no longer green. They were red with fire, black with smoke, gray with ash. Enemy banners moved like living things, slithering across the countryside, swallowing village after village in their path. The wind reeked of scorched grain, burned homes, and distant blood. And still, the girl did not cry. Her name was Anne. Just days ago, her father, Francis II, the last Duke of an independent Brittany, had died. His heart failed before the enemy swords did. With him, something ancient vanished. The last breath of a Celtic nation, stubborn and proud, slipped into the silence of stone halls. And now Anne stood where he once stood, a child made duchess, a girl standing alone in the teeth of a storm that had been building for centuries. She was small, delicate, still soft, with the roundness of youth. But in that moment, the weight of crowns, treaties, and fate descended upon her shoulders, not in ceremony, but in whispers. Across the courts of Europe, men twice, three times her age were already writing her name onto parchment. Contracts, claims, promises, all without her voice, all without her consent. She became not a girl to be mourned with, but a prize to be claimed. Maximilian of Habsburg saw her as a pawn. Charles of France saw her as prey. The Vatican saw her as leverage. In their eyes, she was not a person, but a passage, a bloodline, a title, a solution, a tool. She wasn't even old enough to braid her own hair, but already they had chosen her husbands, her borders, her body, her future. They would call her queen, but it would not be a coronation. It would be a conquest. She would be married 3 times, not for affection, not for alliance, but for ownership. Her womb would become the battlefield. 14 times she would carry a child. 14 times she would pray, bleed, scream, and most of those children, those flickers of hope, those fragile futures, would die, one by one, slipping from her arms like water in cupped hands. They would say she ruled France, but what she truly ruled over was grief. And yet, she would not shatter. She would learn to negotiate with kings, to outmaneuver emperors. She would rebuild Brittany in song, in culture, in art, when she could no longer protect it with laws. Her rebellions would be quiet, deliberate, precise. She would wear silence like a cloak, diplomacy like armor, and memory like a blade. This is not the story of a fairy tale princess. There are no glass slippers, no enchanted kisses, no happy endings. This is the story of Anne of Brittany, a girl born into the jaws of extinction, a child forced to marry her enemies, a woman who buried more than she birthed, but who refused to bury her will. She did not win, but she did not break. And in a world built to forget women like her, she made them remember. Part 1. The Last Duchess. She was 12 years old when the world stopped calling her child. Anne had been born into privilege, yes, but not into safety. The daughter of Duke Francis II of Brittany, she grew up beneath the fading canopy of Celtic independence in a court where ancient traditions whispered through stone halls and old gods still lingered in songs. Her father was a proud man, stubborn and shrewd, the last line of defense between Brittany and the encroaching hunger of France. And he knew it. He raised Anne not with dolls and lullabies, but with maps and strategy. The weight of expectation pressed gently but unrelentingly into her palms. There were no sons, only Anne and her younger sister. And so, when Duke Francis collapsed and breathed his last, his advisors wept not only for the man, but for the fragile thread of sovereignty he represented. The duchy, already fractured and fatigued by years of conflict, now stood exposed, its only heir a 12-year-old girl with grieving eyes. Anne's coronation was not a celebration. It was an act of desperation, a ceremony held under siege, a crown placed on the head of a child because there was no one else left to bear it. The wolves of Europe smelled blood instantly. France saw an opportunity to finish what it had begun decades earlier, to crush Brittany's autonomy and absorb its land and wealth into the ever-expanding kingdom. Charles VIII, the teenage king of France, barely older than Anne, regarded her less as a peer and more as prey. Across the continent, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I watched with different ambitions. For him, Anne was not a conquest, but a potential alliance, a pawn to shield Brittany from French aggression and a valuable foothold in Western Europe. Anne, still in mourning black, suddenly found herself at the center of a political storm she could not control. She was offered no time to grieve, no chance to grow. Every decision was urgent, every gesture scrutinized. And though she scarcely understood the game, she could feel its stakes, a nation's survival, her own body, her future. And so, barely 13, she made her first move. Behind the cathedral doors in secret and silence, she married Emperor Maximilian by proxy, a legal and spiritual union performed in haste, with a stranger standing in place of the absent groom. She spoke the vows in Latin, her voice trembling, her hand held not by love, but by duty. In doing so, she declared allegiance to a man she had never met, hoping to summon an empire between her people and annihilation. It was a bold act. It was a desperate act. It was a child's attempt to wield the weapons of kings. But Anne would soon learn that paper alliances mean little when armies are marching, and that for girls like her, no promise, no matter how sacred, is ever truly safe. Part 2. The Wedding of Conquest. The French did not wait long. Charles VIII, insulted by Anne's defiance and enraged by the proxy marriage to his rival, unleashed his armies on Brittany with swift and merciless precision. Fortress after fortress fell. Towns burned. Families fled into the woods. Brittany, proud and ancient, bled slowly under the boots of foreign soldiers. In the city of Rennes, Anne stood atop the ramparts and watched the horizon darken with French banners. She was 15 now, barely more than a girl, yet with a spine forged in loss. Her advisors pleaded with her, their voices blurred with fear and hunger, but Anne already knew what they were too cowardly to say aloud. No one was coming to save them. Maximilian's promises had evaporated in the wind. The Holy Roman Empire was too distant, too entangled in its own affairs. Brittany stood alone. As winter settled in, the siege dragged on. Supplies dwindled. The people within the city walls began to starve, and the thunder of cannons never ceased. Anne, watching her duchy die one day at a time, made the only choice left to her: surrender. But surrender came with a price so steep it would echo for centuries. Charles offered terms, but they were not negotiations. They were conditions of ownership. Anne would annul her marriage to Maximilian. She would marry Charles himself. In return, Brittany would be spared the sword and placed in chains. On December 6, 1491, inside the Grand Cathedral of Langeais, Anne of Brittany, age 16, placed her hand into the hand of the boy king who had destroyed her world. The ceremony was magnificent by all outward measures: golden cloth, rare jewels, 1,000 noble witnesses. But inside Anne, something cracked. She was not marrying a man, she was surrendering to an empire. The marriage contract was cruel in its precision. Not only did it bind her to Charles, but it declared that should he die, she must marry his successor. Her womb was no longer her own. Her future had been placed in a gilded cage and the key handed to the French crown. Their wedding night was no better. Stripped of ceremony, it became what so many royal unions were: conquest disguised as ritual. The bedchamber was opulent, yes, but it was still a battlefield, and Anne had no weapons. The consummation, witnessed and documented for political purposes, was a violation masked as duty. Her tears were expected, her silence required, and yet, even then, something within her refused to break. She began to build the armor she would wear for the rest of her life, not of steel, but of memory, defiance, calculation. She learned to smile while burning inside, to bow while plotting quietly, to play the part of a queen while mourning the last breath of a duchess. France had taken her land, Charles had taken her body, but Anne had begun the long, painful work of reclaiming something far more dangerous: her will. Part 3, the womb and the crown. Anne's crown was heavy, but not in the way gold is heavy. It was the weight of expectation, quiet, brutal, inescapable. The court whispered with smiling teeth and polished malice. The Duchess turned queen must now give France what it had truly married her for: a son. Her first pregnancy came swiftly. The French court celebrated prematurely, already preparing the tapestries and naming ceremonies. But Anne carried more than just a child. She carried the shame of conquest, the burden of legacy, and the silent prayers of a vanquished nation that still watched her every move. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Sickness, headaches, bleeding, but hope, stubborn as ever, clung to her. And then the child died, 6 months in. Just enough to know it was a boy, just enough to know what had been lost. Anne held the tiny, lifeless body alone, the silence in the room thicker than grief. There were no gentle hands, no time for mourning. Almost immediately, her status shifted from a vessel of hope to a liability of failure. The court, once jubilant, grew cold. Charles barely flinched. The child was dead. Time to try again. And so they did, again and again. Anne would become pregnant 14 times. 14. Each time, she endured the nausea, the fear, the sickening flicker of hope. And nearly every time, that hope ended in a tiny coffin. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who lived just long enough to die in her arms. The palace walls bore witness to her quiet sobs, to the way she clutched amulets and whispered desperate prayers to indifferent saints. To the men of court, each failed pregnancy was a political inconvenience. To Anne, each was a funeral. But she did not break. Even as her body weakened, bones aching, skin pale, breath short, she forced herself to stand tall. While Charles obsessed over Italy and war, she governed. She negotiated with ministers, She wrote letters in her own hand. She led a court infused with grace and intelligence. She ruled the country that had taken everything from her. She was becoming what no one had prepared her to be, not just a queen, but a sovereign in her own right. And then, in 1501, Claude was born, a daughter, alive, breathing. For the first time in years, Anne felt something she had long since taught herself to avoid: joy. But even that joy came with thorns. Claude was not the son France needed, not the heir the crown demanded, but she was Anne's, and that meant everything. Anne poured her soul into Claude, teaching her to read, to think, to watch, to survive. If Anne could not change the rules of the game, she would at least teach her daughter how to play it better. Yet the losses continued. More pregnancies, more graves, more whispers behind fans and velvet curtains. Some said she was cursed, others blamed God. But Anne knew the truth. She was not cursed. She was consumed, piece by piece, breath by breath, by a world that saw her body as a tool and her pain as collateral damage. And still she endured, with less hope, with more silence, but always she endured. Part 4. The Second Crown. In the spring of 1498, death came not with swords or sickness, but with a doorframe. Charles VIII, the boy king, who had forced Anne into marriage, cracked his skull on a low lintel in Château d'Amboise. He fell to the marble floor and never rose again. At just 27, he left no surviving heir, no legacy, but broken campaigns and the silent graves of his children. And suddenly, Anne was free. But freedom, in the language of monarchs, is a fragile illusion. The marriage contract she had been forced to sign nearly a decade earlier still haunted her. In its inked cruelty, it had bound her not just to Charles, but to whomever came next. And now, that man was Louis, Duke of Orléans, soon to become Louis XII. Louis was already married. His wife, Jeanne of France, had been with him for 20 years, a pious, loyal woman, but she was inconvenient now. And in royal courts, inconvenience is an ailment quickly amputated. Louis appealed to the Pope for annulment, claiming Jeanne was deformed, infertile, incapable of fulfilling a queen's most sacred duty. Her dignity was dragged into court, dissected by clerics and lawyers like some grotesque curiosity. Anne watched it all unfold, the slow, humiliating erasure of another woman's life. And in that grotesque spectacle, she saw a mirror, a prophecy. She knew what they did to Jeanne today, they could do to her tomorrow. But Anne had changed. She was no longer the trembling girl in a foreign bed. She had ruled a kingdom, buried a king, buried children, buried pieces of herself too deep to name. She had learned to wield silence like a dagger, diplomacy like armor. When Louis came for her hand, Anne didn't bend. She negotiated. She demanded Brittany's autonomy, its laws, its customs, its dignity. She insisted on choosing her own path if Louis died. She would not be passed along like a state property again. She carved out a fortress of paper and promise in a world built to cage her. And Louis, shrewd enough to see her worth, agreed. They married in 1499. The court was grand, but the power dynamic had shifted. Anne was no longer a prize. She was a partner, albeit still bound by patriarchy, but unafraid to test its limits. Louis proved different from Charles. Calculating, yes, ambitious, always, but not cruel. He respected Anne, not out of affection, but necessity. He knew she was essential to his legitimacy, to Brittany's uneasy loyalty, to the delicate balancing act of French politics. And Anne, now seasoned by sorrow, leaned into her role with sharp precision. She built a court that merged the richness of French grandeur with the soul of Breton tradition. She funded artists, founded schools, preserved language, defended women. She was building something bigger than legacy. She was building resistance, not loud, not bloody, but enduring. Yet, even in this second crown, the old pain remained. More pregnancies, more deaths, more nights of quiet mourning, while the kingdom toasted future heirs who would never draw breath. But Anne had changed the rules, and every time she looked into her daughter Claude's eyes, she saw a different kind of future, not of conquest, but of choice. She would not escape the chains, but she would weaken them, link by link, word by word, life by life. Part 5, The Final Move. By the winter of 1513, Anne of Brittany was only 36, but her body carried the weariness of an old woman. Years of loss had hollowed her from within. Endless pregnancies, each ending in silence. Endless negotiations, each paid for with a fragment of her freedom. Her once bright eyes had grown cautious, watchful, not defeated, never defeated, but tempered like iron cooled in sorrow. Louis XV, her second husband, was aging as well. His health deteriorated, his grip on power loosening. Whispers began to circulate, not of Anne's influence or Claude's future, but of Louis's next marriage. He wanted to remarry after Anne's death, to secure a male heir at any cost, even if it meant discarding everything Anne had fought for. The promises made to her were dissolving like smoke in the corridors of power. But Anne had learned to move before the blade fell. In a final act of brilliance, she arranged the betrothal of her daughter Claude to Francis of Angoulême, the young man who would become Francis I, the next King of France. With this union, Anne secured more than her daughter's crown. She secured continuity, stability, the survival of her bloodline, and more importantly, a place for Brittany in the heart of France's future. It was a move only a mother, a queen, and a strategist could make. There would be no more negotiations after that. Her strength was spent. Her lungs ached, her breath shortened by the day. She withdrew to her beloved Chateau de Blois, surrounded not by courtiers, but by silence. The halls felt different now, less like cages, more like tombs. And yet, there was peace in her retreat, a peace earned, not given. On January the 9th, 1514, Anne died. Not with ceremony or spectacle, but with quiet dignity. Her final words, they said, were a prayer for Brittany, not for France, not for kings or crowns, but for the land that had birthed her, mourned her, and watched her vanish into legend. Her body was taken on a long procession back through the soil of her homeland, and though she had been Queen of France twice over, it was not the French who lined the roads in mourning. It was the Breton people, the farmers, the widows, the children. They didn't mourn a queen. They mourned a daughter, one of their own, who had never stopped trying to bring something of them into the heart of empire. Anne did not save Brittany from being absorbed. She could not stop the tide of conquest, the laws, the language, the banners. But she saved its spirit, preserved in the stories, in the customs, in the art she protected, and the daughter she armed with knowledge. In the end, Anne of Brittany was not remembered for a victorious war. She was remembered for surviving the kind of war no soldier trains for, a war waged on the body, the will, and the soul. She did not win freedom, but she redefined power. She exposed the weakness of a world that thought a woman could only rule by giving birth to sons. Her rebellion was persistence. Her victory was memory. And her final move, a daughter's crown forged from a mother's resistance, would echo through France for generations to come. Ending the wind through Nantes. Long after the crowns have tarnished and the kings turn to dust, the wind still moves through the towers of Nantes. It whistles through the stone corridors where a 12-year-old girl once stood, staring down an empire. It carries the salt of the sea and the silence of 1,000 forgotten tears. If you listen carefully, you might still hear her, Anne, Duchess of Brittany, Queen of France, speaking not in words, but in echoes. She was not the kind of queen who reshaped maps or commanded armies. Her reign was not etched in the triumph of battle, but in the quiet defiance of survival. She was conquered, yes, forced into marriages, made into a mother of graves, traded like property between kings. But within every chain placed upon her, she carved a space of resistance. She taught a daughter not how to obey, but how to endure. She wove her culture into the fabric of her enemy's court. She turned ceremony into leverage and loss into armor. And in the end, she left behind something greater than a lineage. She left behind proof that dignity could live within duty, that womanhood could house both sorrow and sovereignty, and that even in a world built to silence her, she had the last word. Anne of Brittany did not escape the cage, but she sang within it until her voice became stone, memory, and legend. And perhaps that is what it truly means to reign.